Happy Independence Day weekend from Lincoln, the capital city of state number 37, the great state of Nebraska. The beef state, the Cornhusker state, right? My name is Steve Smith, and I'm the communications director of the Good Life Institute, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit whose mission is to help Nebraskans speak clearly on the issues that matter most to our state. Also, along with about 400 other Americans around the country, I'm a National Civic Saturday Fellow, and I've hosted 20 such gatherings in Lincoln since 2020. And since this year, our 250th, July 4th falls on a Saturday, it seemed apropos to share a few thoughts on this magnificent national anniversary. So I want to thank you for being with me. 250 years ago this week, a group of exhausted, fractious, improbably brilliant men in Philadelphia decided they'd had enough of being governed by someone who didn't know them, didn't see them, and didn't even care what they thought. So they picked up their pens. They made their argument. And the world eventually had to reckon with it. So naturally, as we mark this birthday, my mind keeps returning to a very important year. A year that shaped how I understand this country, what it is, what it's tried to be, and what it keeps failing to finish. But why I still believe, despite everything, that it might yet get there. That year, of course, is 1991. Not what you thought, I know. But let me explain, okay? That year, I was a sophomore at the University of Nebraska. I was working on a history minor, and I was knee-deep in a 200-level course on Western civilization. Western Civ, as we called it. The professor, and man, I can still see this guy, bespectacled, portly, at the front of the room, gesturing like he was conducting something that just, like some kind of orchestra of history. That professor, he made a point during a lecture that I've never been able to shake. He said, if you look through the long arc of human history, empires tend to last about 250 years. He ticked them off. The Assyrians, the Persians, the Holy Romans, the Ottoman Empire, the British, each one rose, flowered, grew fat on its own success and might, and then declined. And each arc took roughly the same amount of time, about 10 generations, give or take. Well, he let that sit in the auditorium at Richards Hall for a moment. And then he looked at us. Here's a room of 19 and 20-year-olds in our denim jackets and our neon t-shirts. And he said, so if history keeps this pattern, when you all are in your 50s and I'm either very old or gone, we'll be having quite the national discussion, won't we? And I remember the feeling, how that landed. Something between exhilaration and dread. I thought, oh hell, it's going to happen on my watch. But I was 20 years old, and my generation, of course, was going to be different, like every generation is, obviously. Nothing, I thought to myself at the time, was preordained. This was ancient history. They didn't have cars then. Besides, there was a party that Saturday, so, that weekend I put on my best clothes, I tapped the keg, and I was pretty happy and merry with my friends. I would say, though, that I never forgot that. The thought returned over the years. As I got older, it kept coming back to me. It would come back to me at various times as I grew older, when a president would diminish the office with tawdry affairs, when the Supreme Court would install his successor by a vote of 5-4, and then when that successor led a frightened nation into a war on a concept, terror, and descended us into a 20-year military mess in the Middle East. When that sectionalism and regionalism that used to be our diversity and strength fractured on cultural lines, to the point that you could now see 3 or 4 distinct countries within these United States, leading many to call for a strong man to put it back together in his own image. Given that recent history and all the rest of it, by the way, it's astonishing we've stayed together this long. here in this little mutual aid project of ours. But here we are. Here we are. 250 years young. And our clock is still ticking. So let's talk about it. This is a good day. This is a good birthday to talk about America and to talk about us, Americans. First, let's take an honest look at what we've built. Then, maybe let's reckon a bit with what we've left unfinished. And finally, then let's talk about what a people like us, who've been given habits like ours, might still be capable of doing. Okay, let's start with that magic year, the founding. Or in terms of what we're talking about today, let's call it the first founding. July 4th, 1776. There's that magical year we're seeing all over t-shirts and flags right now. But more accurately, July 2nd, 1776. That's the day the Continental Congress actually voted, 12-0 with one abstention, looking at you, New York, to make the break from England and form a coalition of sovereign powers. Our lives, our fortunes, our sacred honor, you know the words. Independence. John Adams famously wrote to his wife and advisor, Abigail, that the 2nd of July would be celebrated forever with, what did he say? Bonfires and bells. He was wrong only about the date by a couple days. He was 48 hours off. But he certainly was right about everything else, wasn't he? Yeah. And what those men accomplished there in Philadelphia should be celebrated loudly and proudly. Because what they produced was genuinely unprecedented. In making the break and declaring the inherent rights of all men, they also created the political model of the modern liberal state. They enshrined ideas about equality and self-governance that blew people's minds at the time, but it changed the world over the course of history. And it bent that arc of history, that long arc of history we always hear so much about, right? Toward freedom and justice and reason. So yeah, God bless America for that. But our telling of our history can't just stop there, because the whole truth, and this is something the founders themselves knew at the time, because they argued about it in that hot Philadelphia hall. The founding contained two enormous tragedies alongside its triumphs. We know them. One was the failure to end slavery. The other was the failure to protect native peoples from removal and eventual almost near extinction. And those weren't oversights, friends. They were, for want of a better word, choices. They were deliberate compromises that even the sharpest minds of our revolutionary generation felt that they had to make. And then, unfortunately, they handed them down to us. I do like how historian Joseph Ellis, and if you don't know Joseph Ellis, learn about him. He's a wonderful Revolutionary War, Revolutionary Era historian. I like how he framed this great contradiction. He called it the coexistence of grandeur and failure, of brilliance and blindness, of grace and sin. There's something sadly beautiful about those words. So that then was our nation's first founding. I mean, it's not a tidy myth, as many would like, but it's also not a full betrayal, as some would have it told. Both things happened at the same time, so both things are true. We inherited the glory. We also inherited the bill, which came due less than a century later. And that's our second founding. It came out of the bloodiest reckoning of our national habits that had ever been forced on us. 600,000 dead. Fields turned red from Antietam to Gettysburg to the southern wilderness. Suddenly and eventually, victory and surrender at Appomattox. And then in its wake, right? The 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, The 15th Amendment. Those three sacred Reconstruction amendments to our Constitution, enshrined there between 1865 and 1870, were as radical as anything that was put forth in 1776. More radical in some ways, if you think about it. Together, our Union attempted to redeem America's original promise, to extend the founding creed to those who'd been excluded from it from the very beginning. It took our greatest president to explain it plainly, what that moment asked of us as a nation. He said so in the second paragraph of that 2-minute address he gave at Gettysburg. It is for us, the living, to be dedicated to the unfinished work. Strive on, he said. Finish that work. And then 5 days after General Lee surrendered, Lincoln was dead. And then so was much of the work. You know, it's often said that the North won the war, but the South won the peace. And looking back, sometimes it's difficult to refute that. Within a decade, Reconstruction had been abandoned by exhaustion, by deal-making, by the sheer weight of a white majority that didn't want to pay the cost of what equality would actually require. So the federal troops withdrew and the black codes returned in new clothing, and the second founding was left to lie dormant, like a half-open seed under the frozen ground. For a century, then, through a Gilded Age, the closing of the American frontier, the taking of our own colonies, world wars, and other cataclysmic overseas conflicts, we told ourselves this argument was settled. It wasn't. It wasn't. It took until the 1960s when a new generation picked it back up. And they did this without an army. They did it with their bodies and their voices, marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, sitting at lunch counters, organizing precinct by precinct in towns where doing so could get you killed. The ends were worth every last ounce of the means, though. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It's important to note that this generation and its leaders didn't declare a new founding. They were just simply trying to make the second one mean what it said, to finally, at long last, close the gap between those sacred amendments' promises and the country's actual practice. A gap that had been allowed to widen deliberately, violently, for the better part of a century. And they got there. Partly. The legal architecture changed. Certainly. Doors opened in society that had been sealed off for generations. It was real, and we should say this plainly. But I think we also have to argue something else here, and that's something uncomfortable. That generation may have felt in the aftermath of its victories that the work was largely finished, that the arc had bent far enough, that the country, having finally legislated equality, would now simply become equal. It didn't. It didn't. The tools of oppression adapted and changed, as we now know. The exclusions deepened into the economy, into the courts, into the subtle, durable machinery of who gets heard and who gets ignored. All the while, for 50 years, a counter-movement organized patiently, strategically, generation by generation, to roll the clock back. Not all at once, but steadily. Rewrite the rules, pack the courts, flood the zone with suspicious and untruths. Convince enough people that real equality was a problem, not a goal. So, 250 years in, at least 2 attempts at starting anew. And in 2026, the argument the founders were having way back in 1776 sure looks as alive and relevant as it's been in generations. Who counts? Who belongs? Who gets to claim the rights our American creed has promised? It's a reminder, I think, that you can try to bury your history, but it never gets interred very deeply, does it? I know what this might be sounding like. Another lecture about inevitable American decline. Another inventory of everything that's broken. And believe me, that inventory is already too long. I've read the essays, I've seen the data, the polling, the democracy indexes, the political scientists who stopped pulling punches and started raising alarm bells. But here's what I keep coming back to. Here's what I couldn't put down after what I heard in that classroom 3.5 decades ago. Every empire that we studied in that class, every one of them declined because it forgot what made it worth building in the first place. It mistook power for its purpose. It stopped arguing about the important things, the hard things, and started fighting over all the wrong ones. Those empires focused on the trivial, the shallowly cultural, on the things that only affected its comfort in many ways. Each one turned inward and suspicious. And as their power inevitably began to wane, they became cruel. Yeah, America has done all of those things. Look at the news. In many ways, at home and abroad, we're doing them right now. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. You just can't. You can't ignore it. But America also has something those other societies did not. Something that's easy to miss if you're only wallowing about the decline or angry about the latest headline coming out of DC or wherever. We in America, and I believe this in my bones, we in America have the unique, hell, not only unique, but the proven habit of refounding ourselves. Twice already, when the argument got bad enough, when the contradictions grew so acute that they couldn't be papered over any longer, we Americans found a way to crack it all open and try again, didn't we? And I know it didn't happen smoothly. I know. It required blood and grief and tremendous cost, but we did it. We reset the clock. And knowing that tells me that the third founding is still ahead of us. It hasn't happened yet, we know that, and the fact that it hasn't happened yet is not a reason for despair. So what would it look like, this next founding? Well, you ask me, I don't think it looks like a document or some kind of big law or even a seismic election, though those matter enormously right now, as we all know. I don't know. I think it looks like what the first two probably looked like before they merged with our larger national history. People deciding in large enough numbers that the contradictions we've allowed to take root are just not tolerable anymore. Not among a good and moral people. That the gap between our creed and our practice has just grown too wide to ignore. Perhaps it looks like what the Reconstruction Amendments looked like, an attempt, costly and imperfect, to truly mean what we said back in 1776. To truly extend the founding promise and not just recite its tidy myths. It looks like holding our pride in America and yet holding all of the warnings we see at the same table without needing to pick just one. Look, the founders didn't hand us a finished country. They handed us a habit. Show up. Pay attention. Do the work of citizenship. Not because it's easy or celebrated or even noticed, but because the alternative is to let someone else decide what this place of ours becomes. My old professor back in the early 90s, I don't think he was necessarily predicting our doomsday when he put that up on the board. Thinking back now, he was issuing an invitation. He was saying, your generation will inherit this argument, and you'll have to decide what to do with it. This humbles me now. I've been slow to answer. I think a lot of us have. Regardless, we are, without question, having that monumental national discussion he predicted. And it is one that will ring through the lives of those who come after us, just as the clashes in Philadelphia and Gettysburg and Selma have rung through ours. I believe in my heart of hearts that America is capable of something special. I don't believe it because I think the evidence around me is so easy to see right now. It isn't. But I still believe it. I still believe it because of what this country has gone through to arrive at this very birthday. We know what it's cost those of us who have kept the argument alive, especially when the powerful have wanted to bury it. They didn't let it be buried, and it certainly isn't buried now. The clock is still running. The argument is still open. The next founding is still possible. And as we mark this anniversary, that's not nothing. In fact, on a birthday like this one, in a time like this one, that might just be everything. Thank you.